2017, I managed to land myself a part-time job at my local Walmart here in Thornton, Colorado. A fairly large suburb of Denver, Brighton is many things. Close-knit, homely, but it's hardly the most exciting place in the world. I think that's why Halloween is one of my favorite times of year. We take the holiday pretty seriously, so the anticipation and build-up to the spookiest night in the calendar is something I really look forward to. The majority of work at Walmart during that time of year involves sorting and arranging displays for all the novelty Halloween products that are stocked during October. It was hard work, sure, but getting to mess around with all kinds of masks, costumes, and ghoulish accessories was actually really fun, even if it did cause our grumpy old supervisor to glare at us down the aisles. Halloween came and went, but I found myself kind of enjoying working at Walmart. I know that sounds crazy. The customers can be awful and the hours are pretty long, but I had grown close to my coworkers. There were even one or two that I would go so far as to call friends. So naturally, when one of the store managers asked if I wanted to extend my contract into the new year, I jumped at the chance. It would be one of the biggest mistakes of my life so far. The morning of November 1st, 2017 was a gray one of those mornings where the world couldn't be any less inviting. All I wanted to do was crawl back into bed and sleep away the day. But still, I dragged myself into the shower, washing away the cobwebs and preparing to face the day. I was due on from 10:30 until 6:30 that evening. I hated the longer weekday shifts. They had a tendency to drag, but the thought of getting a cup of coffee from my coworker, Teresa, who happened to make the best flat white this side of the Rockies, spurred me on to make it work on time. I was right. The day dragged on so bad I thought I was going to go crazy. The part-time weekend shifts were busy, but at least the activity made the time fly. Spending hours at a time counting endless boxes of merchandise as part of some pointless make-work stock take is enough to make your brain congeal. By the time 6 p.m. rolled around, I was about ready to give up. With so little time left on the clock, I found myself watching the minutes roll by, wandering around the store and pretending to look busy. I saw my friend Miguel hanging around near the front desk and struck up a casual conversation with him in an effort to kill another few minutes. That's when I saw him. I'd like to think I'm not an overly judgmental person, but this guy gave me the creeps right away. He was dressed pretty normally, a black leather jacket and reddish shirt, but it was the man's face that drew my eyes away from Miguel and caused a nervous feeling to run through me. He was pale, almost sickly looking. His cheeks were gaunt, his eyes ringed by black circles, sunken back into their sockets. It looked like a skull with nothing but a thin layer of flesh to disguise it. Miguel must have noticed the look on my face because he too turned to look. I suppose it was for the best that I reacted that way to seeing him. I think it might have saved both our lives. When I look back on it now, it's like time kind of slowed down for a few minutes. I know that's like a super cliched thing you only find in movies, but now I think there's kind of some truth in it. I remember every little moment, every little detail of those few seconds. The way his jacket, a few sizes too big for him, looked almost silly as he reached into the inside pocket. The way the polished metal of his handgun seemed to glint in the bright, artificial light of the store. I watched as the man looked around for a second or two, scanning the shop floor for his first victim, before he raised the pistol and fired. I was completely and utterly horrified. I would come to understand that there are 3 common reactions to a sudden rush of fear, the first 2 being the well-known fight-or-flight responses, but there's also one that no one ever seems to talk about: total shutdown. Unfortunately, that's what I experienced as the deafening bang of the first pistol shot echoed around the building and an unsuspecting customer collapsed to the floor. The older man dragged his shopping cart down with him, the contents spilling out as he lay bleeding on the ground. I couldn't move. I was just frozen to the spot. I had never seen anyone shot and only ever heard a gun fired like once or twice. I felt myself trembling. But for the life of me, I couldn't bring myself to flee the horrific scene of violence unfolding before us. Thankfully, Miguel did not have the same reaction. He grabbed me by my arm, so hard it left a bruise and dragged me behind a display of kitchen appliances to take cover from the shooter. All I could do was hang on to him and pray that the shots would stop. They didn't. Over and over again, the skull-faced man fired at staff and customers alike. I remember hearing this horrible cracking sound, like right next to us as we crouched behind the heavy appliances. I would later learn that this was the sound of the high-speed pieces of lead breaking the sound barrier as they traveled within a few inches of us. Just the thought makes me feel sick, even today. Suddenly, Miguel was pulling me by the arm again as we rushed towards one of the emergency exits that lined the shop floor. Shots were still ringing out as Miguel crashed into the metal bar that opens the door. The pop of the bullets still heard as we spilled out into the freezing Colorado night. Before us were two young children, maybe only about 7 or 8 years old. They were crying, asking for their dad. Those poor things had no idea what was going on, only that a bad thing was happening and they couldn't find their father. We tried to comfort them for a few moments while the sound of police sirens grew louder and louder until the parking lot was awash with the blue flashing lights of cop cars and other emergency vehicles. We eventually reunited the kids with their father, and he openly wept as he thanked us for finding his children. Miguel was struggling to hold back the tears, but I had completely broken down by that point. Many people had. In the aftermath of the shooting, a 48-year-old man named Scott Ostrom was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Ostrom was handed down 3 life sentences for the 3 people he shot and killed, plus another 48 years for the other victims that were lucky enough to have survived his bullets. During the sentencing, the presiding judge said that the killer had a black and malignant heart fatally bent on spreading fear, misery, and death. It was also brought up that Ostrom's sister said that he had never been the same since trying LSD in the 80s. No other motives were given for his crimes. I quit my job at Walmart and went to therapy for a while after the shootings. I felt a lot of survivor's guilt at first, wondering why Ostrom didn't choose me for his first victim, why those other people had to suffer the way they did while people like me got to walk away unscathed. But I mostly just thank God that Miguel was there to save me. Life is very precious, a fragile thing that can be snuffed out in an instant, so I try to live as full a life as I can, if only for the people who innocently shopping that day, unaware that they would never see their loved ones ever again. Babysitting wasn't the job that I had imagined having while I was a senior in high school. I was paid a decent rate by the hour for watching kids that only needed to have an adult around while their parents were out. I know exactly what you're thinking. Why would you willingly waste your time watching children when you could have been working retail or some other halfway decent job? Am I close? Well, as you can imagine, the majority of kids I've looked after were happy, normal children, but my sister's children, let me get to that. Here's a little background just to help you better understand why I don't foresee myself having children anytime soon, if ever. I'm a male and a social outcast at that. I was 16 when my mom told me that I'd be babysitting for my older sister. Naturally, I shrugged it off as it were no big deal because, what's the worst that could happen, right? My sister needed to go out of town on a business trip for 2 days, which then caused my mom to decide that I was the right candidate for the job. I learned very quickly that kids are hungry literally every 5 minutes, and they have no respect for the babysitter, and they are totally out of control without their parents around. That was a bummer. Kids are perceived as sweet, innocent, and all-around pure, yet I have first-hand experience on just how truly creepy some kids can be. I have been around my nieces and nephews dozens of times before, so there wasn't any reason for me to think that they were a bit peculiar, aside from the fact that I walked in on Nat, short for Natalie, attempting to sacrifice her sister to the devil in order to bargain for immortality by shoving Lux's hand into a blender. Luckily, I was able to pry her away from the blender before she could turn it on. I had been watching them for less than 20 minutes when that incident occurred. Fast forward to this first afternoon, the kids were playing in the toy room, so I decided to watch television before doing my homework. I was in the middle of a funny movie when Mike cut the side of my neck with scissors. He drew a pentagram on the floor with ketchup, chanted something in a language that I didn't recognize, they probably made it up, and locked Jay in the basement. Tony was the good kid who explained that Mike was trying to summon a demon, someone that is close to the devil so that he could bargain Jay's soul for immortality. Mike angrily hissed at me when the plan didn't work. I swear to God, those freaking creepypastas they watch really don't help them. It was then that I learned that they had a crazy obsession with vampires. The need to be immortal and trying to draw blood from people is their way to fulfill the desire to be like the people in movies or books. These kids were actually trying to figure out ways that they could become immortal without having to stay so small for all of eternity. I thought that was a bit unhealthy. I still have no idea how the internet or horror movies, when their parents weren't looking, really activated this, but I'm honestly still scared of what could have happened. Nat was the eldest child. She was the bad influence on her siblings. She was the entire reason why everything went down on the second night. I was studying for a calculus test that I had the next day. The kids were supposed to be playing in the backyard, which was the mistake. All I really remember about studying is that I had been exhausted from chasing around those brats the night before because I ended up falling asleep at the kitchen table. I woke up sometime in the afternoon with my hands and feet tied to a metal pipe in the basement, while my deranged nieces and nephews stood over me with a weird look in their eyes. I struggled for a good 10 minutes to free myself from that stupid rope as they chanted some weird language again. I assumed that they were really trying to sacrifice me. However, I was relieved when I saw one of the cats knock a candle off the windowsill. The carpet and lengthy silk curtains immediately caught fire, which caused the kids to untie me. We rushed out of the house and to safety just in time to watch the house burn, literally to the ground. I stood motionless for what seemed like hours before eventually the police were called by the neighbors. I called my mom to come get the kids before being questioned by police for over 3 hours. The detective that was interrogating me surely was about to arrest me, but the fire department later ruled that the fire was an accident. My sister angrily barged into my room once she arrived home and informed me that I was no longer allowed to babysit her kids again, and literally almost beat me senseless if it wasn't for my parents stopping her fury. I cried tears of joy at the news and never babysat again. I tried to explain the story to both the detectives and my family, though my nieces and nephews' stories all apparently corroborated against my own, and there was nothing I could do. Needless to say, I never visited their family again, both by being shunned and by choice. Natalie and the other kids all grew out of the vampire phase from what I heard once they hit junior high, and acquired less creepy, less dangerous interests. I'm 28 years old now, incredibly far away from my family, married to the most amazing woman, yet I still refuse to think about having children. You never know what they're going to get into.
I've had a lot of scary experiences, but I really think this one's the scariest. It was October 2015, and my sister was giving birth, and I was babysitting her son, who was 9 at the time. The second night I was there, this happened. I'd put my nephew to bed in his room, and then the dog in his cage in my sister's room, which I have to get past to get to his room. I then go downstairs and I get on YouTube on my computer. Well, about an hour later, I hear a door slam. I just assume it's my nephew going to the bathroom. I then hear another slam. I assume it's just him wanting privacy, and I then hear a third door slam yet again. I don't know how to explain it, but I kinda just knew that it wasn't my nephew. I kept hearing things being moved around, kinda like a dresser being moved across the floor. I then start to remember that this house was built not as a regular house back in the day. The attic is apparently connected to the house next door. All you have to do is go up the attic, walk a little, then lift the top and climb down the ladder. I had no choice but to go check on my nephew. I'm still hearing noises as I go up. I hear the dog in his cage going absolutely crazy, like he was trying to get out or something. I walk halfway up the stairs, then all of the noise just stops. I look in his room and he's sleeping with his door open. There was no way in hell I was going to walk past that pitch black room. In my mind, as long as he was safe, that's all that mattered. I then walked back downstairs. As soon as I walked back downstairs, I then hear footsteps running, followed by a door slam. Well, the next day I decided to tell my sister and brother-in-law. After I told them, what they said next to me chilled me to my core. Without any concern in the world, they went on to tell me that it was the spirit of our dead neighbor. Now, you're probably thinking, why didn't I just call the cops already? Well, I wasn't really thinking straight at the time. I was just way too scared, and I guess now it's a good thing that I didn't. A few weeks later, my mom had told my oldest niece, who was 16 at the time. She said that whenever she was in there, she always felt the feeling of being watched. To this day, I still don't know if I believe it was a ghost, or maybe an actual living intruder. All I know is that I for sure wasn't alone that night besides my nephew and I. Never again will I babysit there. Screw that.
The following story is told from the point of view of a female. Last Thanksgiving, my boyfriend and I loaded our 2-month-old daughter into our car and drove from Miami to Naples to visit my family. Being new parents, we were extremely nervous about taking such a lengthy trip with the baby and packed for every possible scenario. We left shortly after 12, my boyfriend behind the wheel, and we hit the highway, which was swollen with holiday traffic. After about an hour of driving, the baby became fussy, and we pulled over at a rest stop to feed her and change her diaper. While I was changing her, my boyfriend stood outside the car stretching, and suddenly called my name. Peering outside the car, I looked across the street in the direction he was pointing. There was a clown with a purple star painted over his face, and wild, crazy, unkempt black hair, and a purple and white checkered outfit standing on the opposite side of the parking lot, just waving to people as they pulled in and out of the rest stop. I chuckled and returned to what I was doing, unbothered by the clown, figuring it was just part of some kind of promotion. As we pulled out of the station, the clown waved at us, and I gave a lazy acknowledgement back. Just before my boyfriend took his foot off the brake and eased into traffic, the clown gave me the most hungry, sinister smile I had ever seen, and shouted, "You would look amazing draped over my lap." Even through the closed car window, I heard him clearly, and said, "Wow, what a creep." As we drove away, I repeated what the clown had said to my boyfriend, who hadn't quite heard it, and for a few minutes he was dead set on turning around to confront him. But I told him it wasn't worth it, as we still had a long drive ahead of us. We arrived in Naples shortly after 2:30, and by then, I had already forgotten about the incident and didn't even bring it up to my parents. We had a great time at my parents' place and ended up leaving close to 11:30 at night, much later than we had intended to. My parents tried to convince us to stay, and while we had plenty of stuff for the baby, we hadn't packed any overnight things for ourselves. So we decided just to commit to the drive. We figured that there would be a lot less traffic, and it would take a shorter amount of time to get home. My boyfriend had been driving for about 45 minutes when he asked me if I wouldn't mind taking over, as he was having a hard time keeping his eyes focused. I told him to pull over at the next rest area, and I would take the wheel. After a few minutes, we see a sign for a rest area and pull into it. It wasn't the same rest stop as before. It had no bathrooms, vending machines, or anything. It was basically just a long parking lot, with one row of parking spaces which looped back onto the road. My boyfriend pulled the car into a spot, nose first, so it was facing a long chain link fence, and beyond it, there was just trees and a swamp. I couldn't see anything specific in the glow of the headlights. He put the car in park and left the engine running, and the lights on as he climbed out of the driver's seat. The baby started to fuss as soon as the car stopped moving, and after I climbed out of the passenger seat, I opened the back door to check on her. My boyfriend climbed into the passenger seat and immediately shut his eyes. After I confirmed that the baby was fine and would probably fall back asleep when we started driving again, I shut the back door and made my way to the driver's seat. That's when I heard the sound of the chain link fence rattling and something being dragged across the metal links, steadily drawing closer. I turned in the direction of the noise, and for a split second, I only noticed the dark outline of a figure on the opposite side of the fence, until they stepped into the light of our headlights. It was the exact same clown from the other rest stop. Except this time he had a large red stain splattered across his purple and white costume, and was dragging a broken beer bottle across the fence. He pressed his face directly into the gaps in the fence and smiled at me. He cackled, "Hello again," and started making lewd gestures with his tongue. I was at a loss for words. It was so unbelievably surreal that I could only stare at him in disbelief and horror, not knowing whether I should be truly afraid or start laughing at the absurdity of it. My boyfriend launched himself out of the passenger seat and screamed, "Get in the car!" When he opened his car door, the baby started crying out, and the sound could be heard across the silent parking lot, and the clown immediately started singing in a grotesque, uneven voice. "Rock-a-bye baby in the treetop. When the clown comes, the cradle will rock." My parents had given us a set of fancy glasses for our dining room table. My boyfriend launched one directly at the clown. The glass shattered against the chain link fence and sprayed tiny razor projectiles all over. The clown hissed and immediately booked it to the end of the fence. My boyfriend and I jumped into the car, slammed the doors, and locked them. I threw the car into reverse and backed out of the spot, and as we put the car in drive, we saw the clown charging towards us across the parking lot. My boyfriend yelled at me to hit him, but I swerved to avoid him and floored it out of the lot and back onto the highway. For the next several minutes my heart was racing, convinced that at any moment a speeding car would come up behind us and try to run us off the road, but fortunately that never happened. We were so shaken and traumatized that all we could do for the rest of the way home was ask each other over and over again, what the heck just happened? We could only speculate what the guy was doing out there at 12 a.m., dressed like a clown in the middle of the Everglades on Thanksgiving night. We considered that he was just trying to mess with people, but you would need some serious balls to pull that kind of stunt out there in the Everglades. The people that live around there don't put up with that kind of nonsense. And what was he even doing there? Just hiding behind the dark fence for a completely random car to show up so he could traumatize them? I don't know if the stain on his suit was actually blood, but he made us feel threatened enough that we felt justified throwing something at him. And seeing as how his response was to charge us, I suspect that his intentions were hostile. The fact that we had seen him earlier that day made the situation even worse, because it felt like he was stalking us. My boyfriend had a license to carry a gun, so all I can say is, it's a good thing that he wasn't packing that particular night. This Thanksgiving, we plan to stay home.
Around 9:30 p.m. on the night of August 29th, 2002, 31-year-old Odd. I feel like I should preface this by making it clear that I'm not one of these paranormal-obsessed, ghost-hunting loons that think there's orbs in all their photos. And when I tell you that one of my favorite TV shows is Penn and Teller's BS, where they debunk all those nonsense conspiracy theories and whatnot, I think you get an idea of what kind of person I am. And for years, I went around thinking that science and logic could account for everything, with the only restrictions being the limits of our own knowledge. That was until something happened to me that I genuinely can't explain, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't come up with any legitimate explanation. The whole thing freaked me out so much that it kicked off a kind of hyperfixation in me that lasted for months on end, to the point that my rational skeptic friends started to think that I was losing my mind. But I haven't lost my mind. It actually happened, and as much as people try to tell me that it was nothing but my mind playing tricks on me, I know what I saw, and it just about put the fear of God into me. We're going back to early spring of 2017 here, the time of the year when it's still getting dark fairly early here in the Northeast. It's around 9 p.m. and I'm driving back to Narragansett from my buddy's place in Newport, when I decide to take a shortcut through Saunderston. It's a drive I'd done like 100 times by that point. I felt like I could do it with my eyes closed at a push. But maybe that's what made me so complacent, a self-assured cockiness that's gotten me into trouble on more than one occasion, because about halfway into the journey, I must have switched off and taken a wrong turn. Next thing I know, I'm having to turn into a residential cul-de-sac to make a complete 180, and I'm so embarrassingly lost that I find myself reaching for my phone to check Google Maps, I check my position, mentally make a note of the turns I have to make to get back onto the highway, then start turning off the street as I put my phone away. When bam, there's a car in front of me. I slam on the brakes, let out a string of curse words, and prepare myself for, at the very best, a few scolding honks of their horn. I then start mouthing apologies at the driver, taking my hands off the wheel and being like, "Dude, I'm so sorry. My fault. My bad." When I noticed something really unusual about the car they're driving. It was a legit classic car. And don't go thinking 70s Camaro or something. This thing was a Buick, like one from the 30s or 40s or something. The kind of car you'd expect to see Al Capone climbing out of in Prohibition-era Chicago. And it was crisp, too. The guy must have sunk some serious cash into that thing because pretty much everything looked brand new. I suddenly realized that while I'm checking this guy's old car out, I'm actually still blocking him in. So I start backing up after giving him a nice car kind of thumbs up after pointing to his hood. The guy doesn't react though, at all. The whole time he's just smiling at me through his windshield. And as I start backing up to let him pass, I remember how he almost looked like one of those old ventriloquist dummies. Something about his hair or how waxy and pale he seemed to just trigger the association. Then, right as I'm about to give him enough space, my car just shuts off. The engine, the battery, everything. I jiggle the keys around, kind of frantically by that point, because I figured I'm making a total idiot of myself in front of the dude with the cool vintage car, but nothing happens. Lights won't turn on, engine won't fire, and my first thought is, God, of all the times for my battery to die, why now? My car was a piece of garbage back then, making it disappointing, but not a total surprise. But I'm still blocking in Buick guy, who's surely getting mightily angry after sitting there for a solid few minutes. So I roll my window down, lean out a little, and start yelling over to the guy's car that he has to go around. But he doesn't respond. And all I can hear is this creepy old music coming from his car. I can't see a thing of him because of high headlights. He's not saying a thing, and the freaking song is making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Now this is the part that really freaks me out to recall. As the situation with the guy is turning into something of a standoff, I'm sitting there in the driver's seat wondering why the guy isn't talking, moving, or doing much of anything for that matter. I don't want to honk at the guy. Everything had basically been amicable so far, so I'm just sort of sitting there, waiting, getting more and more anxious as I do so. That's when the lights on my dash start flickering a little, and I think my battery might be coming back on. I don't know much about cars, but I'll take it. So I get all excited thinking I'm going to be getting away from what had been an incredibly awkward situation. I start jiggling my keys in the ignition again, but again, nothing happens. Right until my car radio bursts into life and starts playing the exact same creepy song as the one playing in the other car. It didn't have any lyrics. It was this creepy tritone loop with something playing over it. But somehow it managed to fill me with this feeling of dread as I realized something seriously weird was going on. The whole time I'm basically being blinded by the Buick's headlights while it just sits there. Then suddenly, the thing's headlights cut out. Right at the same time my radio does, and I'm plunged into darkness again with my natural night vision having been totally ruined for a few seconds. While I'm half blinded, I try the ignition once again, and I breathe a huge sigh of relief when my car comes back to life again. But that little moment was severely short-lived because, as my own headlights turn on, the old Buick is nowhere to be seen. It came as such a shock that I actually screamed out loud, spinning around in my seat like I might catch a glimpse of it driving away. But no, there's absolutely no sign of that Buick anywhere. It was like it had just straight up vanished into thin air. You think with a big old engine like that, I'd have heard it driving past me even if I was distracted by other things. And the time between the headlights cutting out and me getting my car running again couldn't be anything over 30 seconds. It would have had to zoom past me to disappear from my view so quickly. Have you ever felt super stoned and you don't even smoke? That's what it felt like. I'm putting the entire thing on myself, trying to explain it away as like a mini stroke or something, and it even occurred to me that my buddy back in Newport might have dosed me with something groovy, so to speak. But no, sober as a judge the whole time. And you can bet I didn't drink anything because those Rhode Island state troopers just love hunting DUIs. So like I said, because I couldn't find any way to explain what happened, it kicked off something of a hyperfixation in me. I revisited the cul-de-sac where it happened, looked up potential classic car owners in the Narragansett area, and researched medical papers on blackouts and time loss. The latter had me convinced that I was suffering from syncopal attacks, basically when your heart doesn't pump enough oxygen to the brain, a pretty serious condition, so, as you can imagine, I was only too willing to pony up for a medical checkup. Doctor listens to my heartbeat and checks my blood pressure, then, without any further examination, declares there's nothing wrong with my heart. He did say that the blackouts can be caused by stress, but at the time, I wasn't particularly stressed about anything, so I ruled that out as an explanation. One point, I went far out and ended up researching those UFO encounters where people experience time loss, but I figured I'd gone far too down a weird rabbit hole with that one. But as for the thing that people really pick up on with my story for some reason, is the fact that I did actually have a bit of luck when it came to my classic car search. There was a guy out in Middleton who had been trying to sell a 1937 Buick Special for years. The thing was a wreck, but he figured it might catch the eye of some vintage car enthusiasts who'd find the time to fix the old beauty up. I played it off like I was interested in making a purchase and still feel guilty about how excited he got, and he got his nephew to text me over some pictures of the old thing so I could take a good look at it. I'm not saying it was the same model or shape as the one I saw in that cul-de-sac, but I'm not gonna lie, it looked pretty similar. But it's an absolute impossibility that it's the same car, right? A coincidence, if ever there was one. Yet some of the people I talk to about this will always point out the connection and tell me I should have asked where he'd gotten it, if the old thing had been involved in a murder or a hit and run. Truth is, the guy didn't know. He said his dad picked it up at a police auction and died before he could get a chance to fix it up. And obviously, anything he knew about the car was buried with him. I suppose I've rambled on enough about this now, and I've already made my point that I can't explain what happened to me that night without sounding like a complete fruitcake. So, I guess I'll just do what I always do, and leave it up to you guys to decide what it was. But please, don't tell me ghost car or whatever, because I've been hearing that nonsense for like 4 years now, and I'm sick to death of hearing it. And besides, hypothetically, I did believe in ghosts. I think it would mess me up pretty bad to think that I got so close to one, but still drove away, unscathed.
I recently moved across the country to a new town to go to school. I was able to land a job as a pizza delivery driver pretty easily. I've done this job before, and I like it because it's relatively easy and I make good money on tips. I work a lot of really late night shifts. A couple of weeks ago, I was working and at about 2 a.m. an order came in. It was for a large cheese pizza. At that hour, it was just a couple of us working, so I made the pizza myself and then put it in my car and went to deliver it. I didn't know the area very well, so I would always put the address in on my phone and then just follow the directions. I got in my car and typed it in. It said it was a 15-minute drive. As I drove, it seemed to be taking me into the middle of nowhere. I drove for about 10 minutes through woods with not a building or house in sight. Then finally, I was supposed to turn onto a little dirt road that I could barely see. If it hadn't showed up on my map, I would have almost certainly missed it. I slowed down and then turned onto the little dirt road. The map showed me continuing on this road for about 1 more mile, and then I would take a left, and the destination would be there. I began driving down the dirt road, which was surrounded by woods. Then suddenly, my phone lost signal. I wasn't all that surprised being so far out from the city, but I was concerned because I needed to find the house to deliver the pizza. I kept driving very slowly and looked for a road on the left side. Finally, I saw it and I turned. The road was another dirt one, but the woods on each side was even more dense. It was very eerie being out there on that road at that time of night, especially not knowing where I was. I drove down the road very slowly, looking on both sides for a house or some kind of building for whoever ordered a pizza out here. But all I saw was trees from the dense woods and some grass. I still had no service at all on my phone, but I knew I had to be close to where the delivery was supposed to be. It was very dark and hard to see, with the only lights coming from my headlights. I wasn't seeing any kind of buildings at all. I started to get a really creepy feeling being out there, and after about 5 minutes of driving down that road looking, I decided to turn around and go back, because I could clearly see that there was no buildings. I drove my car back to the other dirt road, and then back to where I had signal before. At last, I was finally able to get connection on my phone, and when I did, I looked at the map again, but the address had been erased and it was not there. I found the card that I had wrote the address on and put it back into my phone, but this time it said address not found. I decided I would just head back and try to figure out what was going on. When I got back to the store, I showed my boss the address and told him what happened. He looked surprised when I gave him this information. Then he told me that there are no houses or buildings in that area at all. I went back to look at the order that had come in, but it was gone. I chalked it up to a lack of sleep, but to this day, I really don't know how to explain what happened. Maybe I was just really tired, but it was still a really creepy experience.
I graduated high school almost a year ago. I really had no urge to attend college or military and basically got stuck in my boring hometown for months, where I slowly became dependent on Xanax and booze, and was destined to repeat the cycle of white trash that my parents had set up for me, and their parents before, and so on. I knew I had to leave my hometown, so I decided to sign up for a website you may have heard of called WWOOF.com, Worldwide Opportunities in Organic Farming. You pay a small fee, and they tell you about available organic farming operations that will feed you and allow you to stay with them in return for a certain amount of work around the farm. The place I decided to commit to was a Hare Krishna community in the Deep South. I got there and my car almost immediately broke down. It was a 30-year-old Chevy Blazer I bought on Craigslist for about $500. I later found out that it was beyond repair by this point. The closest town was about 20 miles away, so I found myself stranded, surrounded by the most unbearable hipsters. To be more specific, I would say about a third of the population of this community were either first or second generation Indian immigrants living near the temple for religious reasons. Another demographic were aging hipsters also there for spiritual purposes, but also running the small-scale organic farm located on the property. Everyone else, however, self-absorbed, condescending, right out of college but vapid as shit hipsters. I basically kept to myself, but occasionally was forced into conversations about vibrating crystals and their 3-year spiritual journey, no doubt being funded by their parents. I had been there for weeks and was desperate for a real conversation, and then Michael showed up. I had heard stories about Michael. A couple of days before I showed up, he had left to retrieve an impounded car in a large city about an hour away. Everyone said he was lazy and insane, and would spend hours in his room doing yoga instead of coming down and working with the rest of us. He showed up late in the evening, going on about how he was really going to get involved with the farming, and how he was going to throw himself into the Krishna consciousness. He was in his early 30s, and looked like a balding Hasidic Jew, his unwashed sideburns curled. He spoke like a stoner cartoon character, his sentences always punctuated with, and like, giving his utterly fried brain time to figure out what the others wanted to hear. He reminded me of the many friends I had left back home. We became fast friends, as he was the only person there who didn't give me the urge to bite my fingers off when he spoke. We were both from Texas, so we talked about the loony conservative teachers we had in high school, football, and, of course, drugs. Every now and then he would bring up subjects that really threw me off. He wasn't able to get his car out of the impound garage, so he schemed the best way to break it out. These plans involved firearms, pipe bombs, and telepathy. He told me he came to the Hare Krishna temple to befriend some of the gurus and learn Reiki meditation, a form of meditation used to control the minds and bodies of other people. He told me he believed he had used Reiki once to seduce a woman at a party. This is when I understood his reputation. I simply nodded and laughed occasionally when he went off on these rants. I knew that one day I would reach a saturation point for his absurdity, but I could probably endure it for a week more. A couple of days later, we were eating lunch with one of the gurus. I was telling Michael about my trip to the giant field where the Branch Davidian used to be. He wasn't sure what the Branch Davidian was, so I explained to him about Waco, David Koresh, and the botched siege operation by the FBI and ATF that led to the death of 76 Davidians and 4 ATF agents. He was enraged upon hearing this. Like, the government is always trying to silence people preaching the truth, man. Like, that's so fucked up. I wanted to explain to him that David Koresh was a sociopathic cult leader, interested in power and nothing else, but he wasn't having it. Now I was getting angry. He was throwing a tantrum about a subject I had just explained to him, and now he was telling me that I'm wrong and that Koresh was a martyr. That's when I saw the truly insane Michael. He was spitting, red as a beet, pacing back and forth. I left the table and got back to work, but he followed me. After half an hour of this absurd argument, I couldn't handle it anymore. I'm not having this conversation with a fucking lunatic, Michael. How can I expect logic from you? You came here to get superpowers. The look in his eyes changed from anger to hatred. He got real still and then came at me. Michael was a big guy, much bigger than me. He lunged at me and I ran. As I ran, I went through my pocket, praying that I had grabbed my knife before I left my cabin. I know it sounds ridiculous, but you don't walk around my old neighborhood without some sort of protection. Plus, it was a pretty useful tool on the farm. Luckily, I had grabbed it. I turned around and he saw it. He stopped and contemplated for about 3 seconds. He then turned around and finished his lunch. The next day, I pulled the temple president aside and explained to him what happened, and that we should probably get rid of him. It didn't take much convincing. No one really cared for him, and he wasn't much help on the farm. I felt kinda bad snitching on the guy. He was in a pretty desperate situation. He had no car, no money, and I can't imagine he had many friends. The temple president also informed me that he had been an alcoholic for 10 years and came here to get sober. I found it very strange that he never told me this. Later that day, I saw through my window someone drive up and hand him several suitcases for him to pack what little he had. I saw them both drive off to God knows where. Weeks went by, and the whole encounter kind of faded from my conscience. Late one night, I got a text. "Hey, this is Michael. We can get my car out for like $280. Wanna go traveling?" I never responded. I'm not sure how he got my number, but I figured he looked me up on Facebook or something. A few nights later, I was in the temple office using the Wi-Fi to send some emails. I was making my walk back to my cabin, and from the pitch black, I could hear a lot of loud banging coming from the barn. I remember thinking it must be an animal, but also thinking that it must be a pretty big one to make that much noise. I entered my cabin. The actual door to the cabin doesn't have a lock, but my bedroom door did, so I used that one. I was pretty unsettled by the banging, but I figured my imagination was getting the best of me. Later that night, I woke up needing to take a piss. The cabin didn't have a bathroom, but we did have a shared outhouse. I didn't feel like putting on shoes and walking around in the dark, so I figured I would just piss in the sink. I know it's gross, but I'm the only one who uses that kitchen. I opened my bedroom door and nearly pissed myself right there. Michael, completely naked, was crouching in the corner of my kitchen, facing the wall. I made a noise I wasn't aware I could make, something you would hear Shaggy make on Scooby-Doo. The noise alerted Michael to my entrance. All he did was glare at me and shake his whole body. I slammed my door and locked it almost immediately. I knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to pacify me with Reiki meditation. I called 911. I didn't open my door or even approach it until I saw the red and blue lights outside my window. Michael wasn't there when they arrived. My guess is he ran deep into the woods that surrounded the farm. I explained to the police Michael's story and what happened that night. There wasn't much they could do since no one seemed to know anything about Michael. I didn't even know his last name. I had to leave the farm shortly after. Calling the police was really frowned upon since I believe many of the old hippies thought they were still avoiding the draft. I didn't mind leaving either. I couldn't sleep knowing Michael might still be out there in those woods, angrier than he was before. I stayed up for almost 3 days while I waited for my friend to come pick me up.
A few years ago, I lived in my car. I was fresh out of college and overwhelmed with student debt. And being young, dumb, and 21, I thought car living was a good way to save money. I live in Southern California, so the rent is high and the weather is temperate enough to make this possible year-round. One night, I decided to park in a neighborhood I thought I knew well. It was right by the beach and a couple blocks next to an ex-boyfriend of mine, so I felt safe there, as I had walked the streets at night plenty of times. I parked, locked the doors, hung up the curtains so no one could look in, plugged in my earplugs so the cars passing wouldn't wake me, and fell asleep. Now my earplugs were effective, but crappy, and I could always count on them falling off in the middle of the night. I actually preferred this because it meant I could fall asleep, but still hear my phone alarm in the morning. It was about 2 a.m. when I woke up to my earplugs already have fallen off, and something feeling wrong. Odd scratching noises were coming from the window. It started at the passenger side door and then moved to the back seat doors. I froze, unsure of what to make of it, painfully aware that I leave my windows slightly cracked at night for ventilation. I honestly didn't know what to do, so I stayed frozen, trying to make sense of it all. That's when the flashlight turned on, and some man unmistakably was shining his light in, trying to find a crack in the curtains, and to my horror, he found one and shined it right where my face was. It's hard to explain, but the position of my head made it so I could piece together what was happening, based on the light everywhere, but he couldn't see my eyes. The scratching then continued, and I knew I was screwed. This went from potential attempted car theft to someone knowing I was in the car. I was literally paralyzed with fear and couldn't will myself to grab the baseball bat that I had. I wish I could say I screamed something truly bad, but what left my lips was a loud, aggravated, and forceful, "Excuse me." It was super lame, but it echoed. To my immense relief, I hear the sounds of his footsteps running away at top speed. But I kid you not, the man was laughing as he ran like it was some kind of game. I was still paralyzed, but eventually, him running gave me the courage to get up, grab my bat, and shove my way to the front seat, where I started the car and sped away. I didn't see him, and I spent the night at a friend's house. I live in an apartment now. It wasn't until the next morning I realized I had parked 1 block away from a bar, and at the time of the incident, the bar had just closed.
In June of 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Martin accompanied his family on a camping trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a mountain range rising along the Tennessee-North Carolina border in the southeastern United States. The name Great Smoky Mountains comes from the natural fog that often hangs over the range, appearing as large smoke plumes from a distance. Interestingly, this fog is caused by chemicals emitted from the local flora, chemicals that have a high vapor pressure and easily form vapors at normal temperature and pressures. Yet even having heard the scientific explanation behind the phenomenon, seeing all that fog clinging to the hilltops is a very eerie sight indeed. Hailing from nearby Knoxville, Tennessee, the Martin family had a long-running tradition of celebrating Father's Day by taking camping trips to the Great Smoky Mountains. In 1969 would mark young Dennis's first trip into the woods, in the company of his father, older brother, and grandpa. The group drove out to Cades Cove, an isolated valley located in the Tennessee section of the park, then hiked out towards Russell Field, where they set up camping and began preparing for their first night under the stars. The following morning, they set off for a place known as Spencefield, a picturesque highland meadow and popular camping spot, which was bisected by the rolling hills and jagged mountain peaks of the Appalachian Trail. When the group arrived at Spencefield, Dennis and his older brother set off to explore the campsite, and reportedly talked to many of the other campers who had pitched their tents nearby. This is how they got talking to a ragtag group made up of other campers' children who made fast friends with the Martin boys. Dennis' father was pleased to see his son getting along so well with the other kids, and having his sons occupied meant the adults could get on with the important task of assembling their 4-man tent. Once the task was completed, Dennis was still playing with the group of other kids, and his father says he watched as the group gleefully took up hiding positions from which to playfully ambush a group of approaching adults. When the grown-ups entered the kids' make-believe kill zone, they all jumped out, growling and roaring like wild animals as they set upon their laughing parents. All but one. All but little Dennis. His father watched with growing concern as the seconds ticked by, and Dennis had yet to emerge from his hiding spot. Eventually he couldn't bear it anymore, and after rising from his camping chair, Dennis's father marched off to the spot where he had last seen his 6-year-old son and began calling out his name. But what started out as stern fatherly commands soon degenerated into terrified pleas, and as he continued to call out in desperation, the other families began to realize that something was terribly wrong. Once Dennis's grandpa knew he was missing, he set the group into action, sending one group 2 miles up the Appalachian Trail with his son, while he led another group back towards the Cades Cove Ranger Station, arriving there around 8:30 p.m. that night. Thus began an extensive, well-publicized search and rescue operation, in which National Park Service personnel was supplemented by National Guard soldiers and even a unit of Green Berets. At the peak of the search operation, more than 1,400 people were operating in the few square miles around Spencefield, but not a single one found anything that could lead them to the missing boy. However, in the aftermath of the operation, the search efforts drew a great deal of criticism from search and rescue experts far and wide, who said the large number of personnel involved potentially obscuring tracks in ground that was already difficult to track over due to heavy rain. Shockingly, a shoe print belonging to that of a child was actually found at one point, but the track was dismissed as belonging to one of the Boy Scouts that was helping with the search. Later, however, investigators kicked themselves when they found that the tracks were determined to have come from a child who was missing one shoe, which disappeared on the banks of a stream. Some suggesting it was possible that the tracks belonged to Martin, and this theory was supported when a discarded child-sized shoe and sock were found just 3 days later. Although search and rescue personnel continued their search for more than 2 weeks, scouring the hillsides night and day in continual shifts, no further clues to Martin's whereabouts were ever found. The Martin family was so understandably desperate for answers that they offered a $5,000 reward for any information that would reunite them with their beloved Dennis. This got the attention of a handful of so-called psychics, who some might argue sought to exploit the Martin family's grief, and maybe cashing in if they guessed the right area of the Smokies to search. Surprisingly, none of these psychics ever proved to be of any help. Many years later in 1985, a man who had apparently been illegally collecting American ginseng in the park claimed to have come across the skeletal remains of a child while exploring the woods. The man said he should have reported the find, but was terrified of being prosecuted for his prohibited herbal hobby. Not only that, but he was also unable to point investigators in the direction of the site he'd found the bones in the first place. There have been many theories that have attempted to explain what happened to young Dennis Martin that day. Most detectives, both amateur and professional, believe that Dennis became disoriented whilst looking for a hiding place, maybe even forgetting his way back to camp when he emerged from it. Either way, Dennis then strayed further from the camp and could easily have fallen down one of the many steep slopes and ravines that dotted the area surrounding Spencefield. However, Dennis was wearing a bright red t-shirt when he went missing, not something that would be easy for search and rescue teams to miss. Dennis would have to be completely covered in foliage to remain undetected with that color of shirt, and despite it being feasible due to his small size, the likelihood of that is extremely low. Others are quick to remind us of the presence of black bears in the area, as well as copperhead vipers and feral pigs, all of which would have posed a considerable threat to 6-year-old Martin. Park rangers told investigating police that an underweight bear had been caught in a boar trap in the Spencefield area just 2 weeks earlier. Although the bear was released safely, the incident suggested that it may have been struggling to find enough food, prompting to turn to a less familiar source of food. Yet, however tragic and brutal the aforementioned theories are, Dennis's father believes something considerably more sinister. Based on the eyewitness account of one Harold Key, who says he heard a loud scream on the very same afternoon that Dennis disappeared, Dennis's dad firmly believed that his son was kidnapped by an opportunistic predator. Shortly after he heard the scream, Harold Key claimed to have seen a disheveled, bearded man with wild, unkempt hair fleeing through the woods in an apparent bid to remain undetected by the nearby campers. Harold's family went on to explain that they saw a flash of red on the figure's shoulders, which some believe was actually Dennis himself, slung over the shoulder of this mysterious figure as they carried him away. Harold later speculated that the man may have been a moonshiner, explaining his reluctance to be seen. Despite the report, FBI investigators ultimately dismissed it, saying that as much as Harold meant well, his account was frankly unreliable as his timeline of events were off. But one retired park ranger lamented the failure to properly follow up either the footprints or the sighting of the rough-looking man, arguing that as the location of the sighting was downhill from where Dennis disappeared, it was possible to cover that distance in the time frame, even carrying a child, but that the individual in question would have some impressive strength, stealth, and endurance. So if this is the case, who is this hairy mystery man? This bearded vagrant who was apparently capable of such an impressive physical feat, even if it was in the context of the despicable abduction of a child. Given the lack of investigation into his sighting or his tracks, it seems we might never know. But even if we did get to the bottom of the mystery of a man living in the Appalachian Mountains with a penchant for kidnapping children, I don't think the answers would bring us any solace. Maybe the closure would be worth it, especially for the family, but nightmares can be a high price to pay, and wondering what happened to young Dennis Martin can give even the most hardened true crime reader some very sleepless nights.
A few years ago, I was looking for a roommate. The vacancy had risen because my previous one was a Swedish guy who had been having some trouble with homesickness. Eventually it got too much and he moved away to somewhere with a colder climate. So, as you do, I put some ads up on various sites and it didn't take long before a guy called Robert responded. We messaged back and forth a couple of times and arranged to meet up one day at Starbucks. I was immediately struck by his easy charm and wit. You couldn't hope to meet a person who was easier to talk to. He was in art school with ambitions of making it big as a painter. How exactly one would go about that I have no idea, but we had become friends straight away, and I didn't think twice about letting him move in. Just before we parted ways that day, Rob, as he'd insisted I'd call him, asked a question I really didn't anticipate. "Hey, I know this is a weird question, but, are you by chance afraid of clowns?" He said with a weird smile. I suppose so," I replied, wondering why anyone would ask. "I probably watched Stephen King's It at a stupidly young age. Are you scared of them?" "Oh, damn," he said. "I'm a clown on the weekends. I do like charity events and fundraisers, visit sick kids in hospitals sometimes. Is that a problem for you? I mean, I know some people are seriously afraid of clowns." "Oh, of course not. That sounds cool. It's just the bad clowns that scare me, you know." I had never personally known one before, but Rob didn't seem scary. "I promise, I don't kill kids," he said with a grin. He threw his neck back and drained the last of the coffee from the cup. "It's the adults I go for." I burst out laughing at his dark sense of humor. What a cool guy, I thought. I'm actually going to be looking forward to this new roommate situation. Our first few weeks living together went about as smoothly as possible, and things were a good deal more peaceful than they had been with my previous roommate. I definitely didn't miss being woken up at unholy hours by his sobbing. Rob would get up, go to class, come home, then paint or have a quick drink with a friend or two. Sometimes on the weekend, he'd put on his clown suit and go out to those charity events that he talked about. He didn't seem like a scary clown. He was so cool, in fact, that he even began to change my view of clowns. There was a freezer in our kitchen that I told Rob not to bother using. It hadn't been right since before he moved in. I kept meaning to call someone to come out and look at it or replace it, but I guess it must have slipped his mind. One day, about 5 months after Rob moved in, I came home to find the lights on but total silence in the house. That was strange. Rob was always watching TV or playing his guitar. He hated silence. But I really knew something was up when I noticed something different about that freezer. The freezer door was open. I walked over, looked inside. Oh my God. 8 chunks of a human body, all cut up neatly and stored tidily on the shelves. I can't really explain how I felt in that moment. I panicked. What the hell can you do in that situation? My mind was racing, and I thought back to the day we met Rob, and he made that joke about only killing adults. Holy shit. Just then, a faint shuffling noise came from Rob's room. I didn't know what to do. For some reason, I tiptoed over to his room to see what the hell was happening. I don't know. I suppose adrenaline just takes over at that point. I peered in, and sure enough, there he was, lying on the floor with a mad look in his eyes as he stared at the ceiling. After a long delay in which I'm sure he was aware of my presence, he looked up at me. "You sick bastard! I'm calling the police." Clowns are the worst roommates, don't you think? Always uncovering the dead bodies in places you specifically told them not to look. I'm afraid I had to kill him too. So now my old Swedish friend has a dorm partner to sleep along with him in that big freezer. Oh, by the way, I'm still looking for a new roommate, if anyone's interested. Last January, I was working as an associate at the Walmart over in Lake Charles. I was working second shift, so that's 1 p.m. to 10 p.m., and it was about 7 p.m. when people started to notice some kind of drama going off in the parking lot. The greeter noticed it first and was actually getting ready to have someone call the cops, but the whole thing seemed to die down, and then, from what I heard, things sort of just chilled out. I asked a coworker if anything juicy had happened, and she said no, but that the drama was between 2 groups of teenage girls and that one of the groups had walked into the store. They weren't being loud or obnoxious or anything, not at first anyway. They were just walking up and down the aisles talking among themselves, and one of the girls seemed to be making a video of them just hanging out. I remember hearing one of the girls saying something like, "Man, I need my taser back." But I just put that down to them talking smack after almost getting into a fight or something. The other thing I know is that
loss prevention was watching them after one of them seemed to take something out of the kitchen utensils section, but they were just keeping their distance and observing until they tried to make an exit for the store. This is actually super relevant to what happened later on too, so keep it in mind. Anyways, I went back to what I was doing, and then the next thing I know, there's all kinds of screaming coming from near the front section of the store. I walked around to see what was going on, and that's when I see a group of girls in the doorway, shouting at the group that was inside. They were all saying all this stuff like, "Where are y'all at? Come out." They knew the other group had walked inside the Walmart and were obviously trying to find them. The greeter was trying to get them to calm down or leave, saying they could either stop making a scene or he was going to call the cops, but neither group was paying him any mind. Then, one of the girls in the doorway group starts saying something threatening, and the other is all like, "I'm about to come out as soon as my sister gets here." But the other girl didn't want to wait for that. She just walks inside the store and marches straight over to this girl with dyed blonde hair. I'm like, snap. This is about to go off right here. And honestly, just like that, the two girls start throwing hands at one another in that typical girl fight way, just flailing their hands at one another. Then the girl with blonde hair, she reaches for something in her pants, and although I didn't see it clearly, she swings at the other girl's chest, and it looks a lot like she just punched her. But then as soon as the hit connected, the blonde girl backed up, then ran off while the other girl just sort of staggered back, then looked down at her chest. I didn't see the blood, not right away, I just heard the screams. What I did see was the girl who had been hit stagger a few steps, then just collapse on the floor. Then when her friends dropped down and rolled her over, that's when I saw the blood on the floor. The EMTs were called, the girl was taken away in an ambulance, and we were all basically tasked with comforting the girl's friends as they were absolutely all shooken up that they just watched their girl get stabbed. Then, about 9 p.m., because we had to empty the store out so the cops could do their thing, I was told I could finish early so I could go home and try and get the whole thing out of my head. But then a half hour after I walked through the front door of my parents' place, I get an Instagram DM from one of the younger coworkers that I was tight with. They ask something like, "You were working second shift tonight, right?" And I respond, "Yeah, some messed up stuff happened." Then the next thing they send me is this long link that had Facebook in there somewhere. I figured it'd just be a sharing of a news story about the whole stabbing thing, but when I opened up the link, it opens up one of those Facebook Live videos, and instantly I knew what I was watching. I knew what I was watching because, 1, I recognized one of the girls from the stabbing at work, and 2, they're saying things like, "That was too much," and "If she killed her, she killed her," and then shrugging it off as if though it was her fault for coming at them and her friend was just defending herself. And then it got way worse. They were literally bragging how they killed someone, and they knew they killed someone too. I mean, I just thought the girl would be taken to the ER or something, but they knew she'd stabbed her in the heart because she aimed to stab her in the heart. We didn't find out until the next day that the girl who got stabbed had died on the way to the hospital. The most effed up thing though, none of those girls looked older than my little sister, who was a high school freshman at the time. Some of them barely looked like they'd gone through puberty yet. I mean, these were literally kids, literally effing children, and they just killed somebody and were proud of it. I think maybe it was just that they were trying to hide how scared they were, or trying to establish the whole self-defense thing before the cops came looking for them. But my God, seeing that kind of savagery coming out of a kid made my heart break for humanity a little. Those girls had ruined their lives with one little fight, and even worse, they'd literally ended another girl's. Taken her away from her family, friends, all she had going for her in life, all because of one stupid fight.
So in 2012, my then girlfriend and I went on a big year-long road trip through the States, working on farms along the way for room and board, and ended our trip by driving across Canada, west to east, stopping back in Nova Scotia where we lived. At some point we got a puppy, and around the time we got to Alberta, With an extra mouth to feed, money was running out. Since I'm a carpenter, I decided to find a place to rent, and I would get a job for a few months before we kept going on our trip. We scrolled through Kijiji, the Canadian Craigslist, and eventually found an ad for a place. There was this one guy who lived in a very cool-looking house and was only a short drive from where I had found a job at. He wanted someone to move in with him to help out with the bills. We started corresponding with him by email. I told him that I was going to work in the area and my girlfriend would be staying home with the puppy. Being desperate and having become accustomed to trusting strangers throughout this long trip, we agreed to send him a deposit and take the offer. We got to this place a few days later. It was in the middle of nowhere and there were no neighbors, but we had known that before. This guy looked to be about 30 to 35, small framed, and just looked like a regular working country dude. Except his expression was weird. It was like he was scared or something. He almost looked like he was ashamed of himself. He was fine with our dog being inside, though he had a dog that wasn't allowed inside. This struck me as weird since this is the cold Canadian North. Right away, he met us at the door, and I felt there was something off about him. It made me uneasy, especially since I would be going off to work every day, leaving my girlfriend alone with this creepy guy. But she didn't seem worried, and I didn't want to be controlling, so I let it go. The first night we were there, he wanted to have a few drinks with us. We obliged politely. He brought us a few cans of shitty watery beer, and meekly drank his while sitting across the kitchen table from us. We tried to relax the situation and asked him a few friendly questions about himself. His answers were brief and quiet. He seemed to want friendship, but also seemed completely unsure of how to get it. He went over a few rules he had. Number 1 was to stay out of his room, which was obviously fine. Number 2 was that we were not allowed to go into the basement. Kind of weird. And number 3 was to stay away from the barn. By this point, I could imagine the headlines. Nova Scotian couple found murdered, bound in barn. That night, I didn't sleep very much. I wasn't supposed to start work for a couple of days, so I just stayed up reading and playing with our pup. I heard his truck pull out of the driveway pretty early in the morning. I headed for the basement because I just had to know what was down there. It was pretty bare. Just a few washing and drying machines and some lawn chairs. But I opened a closet door and found a weird nurse costume that looked like it was for sexual purposes. A roll of duct tape, a set of handcuffs, a shotgun, and a box of shells, all sitting together on the same shelf. I woke up my girlfriend and explained that she no longer had any say in the matter and that we were leaving before he got home. We sent him a message after we left, lying, saying that one of our family members had gotten sick and we were moving back home. He never offered to return our money, and we had no more contact with him. I'm still waiting to see him in the news. My ex thinks that I worry too much, but her parents thanked me profusely. And I still wonder what was inside that barn.
I am a 21-year-old female. Around 3 years ago, when I turned 18, I decided to get a job as a pizza delivery driver. We lived in a small town, and there wasn't much, but there was a little pizza place. My older brother had worked there as a pizza delivery driver the year before. I went in one day to ask for an application to work there. The owner was a middle-aged man named Gary. He told me I was hired as soon as I asked for the application. I thought he must be joking, so I laughed, but then he said he was serious. I remember my brother had said that Gary was a little weird, but I didn't really mind as long as I had a job. I got trained the next week, and soon after was my first real day on the job. I was scheduled to work a night shift, and when I arrived, it was just me, Gary, and another kid that I went to high school with named Mike. Like I said, it was a small place and a small town, so it wasn't usually that busy. I waited around and swept the floors for a few minutes before an order for a delivery came in. How it would usually work is Gary would make the pizzas, and then the drivers would deliver them. When the pizza was done, I was told to deliver it, so I took the address and then the pizza and got into my car. But when I did, Gary followed me. He told me he wanted to ride with me and make sure I did the delivery correct. I was a little annoyed because I knew I would get it right, and I didn't want him going with me. I thought it would be really awkward, and Gary just kind of gave me the creeps. He was the boss though, so I had to do what he told me to. I got in and drove to the address without a problem. Gary didn't really say anything during the drive, he just watched me. We arrived at the house and I got out and gave them the pizza. Gary stayed in the car and waited. When I got back to my car that was parked on the street, I saw that Gary was in the driver's seat now and was motioning for me to get in the passenger side. I got in and asked him why he was driving. He said he needed to show me something. I was getting a bad feeling, and I really didn't like Gary driving my car. I asked him again what he was doing, this time with a more stern tone in my voice. But he didn't answer me this time, and focused his eyes on the road. He started driving back, but then made a turn that I realized was not the right way to go back. Then Gary spoke, but his tone of voice changed. He said, "Just shut up." I knew then that I was in trouble. I feared for what Gary might do, and he was much bigger than me. He took a road that led more into the wilderness, and we drove for several minutes. Then I saw a stop sign coming up. I did just what I felt I had to do, and as soon as the car came down to a slow enough speed, I opened the door and got out, and then I ran as far away as I could. I started running in some grass, and then sort of a wooded area. As I was running, I heard his door open, and I heard him shouting, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. That made me run even faster. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed to get away. I ran for as long as I could before running out of breath, and then I hid behind a tree. I didn't hear him or anything, so I decided to take out my phone and call my mother. I told her what had happened, and she had me turn my location on so she could pick me up. She arrived about 15 minutes later and then called the police. My car and Gary had both vanished. He ended up being found and arrested a week later. My car was found in his garage. His restaurant was shut down, and I ended up getting a job at a local grocery store instead.
This happened just last night. I live in the middle of nowhere in Nebraska, and my older cousin Odo and I were driving back home from the Home Depot in town, traveling at about 50 miles an hour down a long stretch of road with fields on either side. And I'm not joking when I say that clowns started appearing out of the tall grass to our left, at least 9 or 10 of them, each of them looking at us. They all put out their arms and acted like they were going to grab the truck. I was at the wheel, and Odo called out, "Holy shit, really?" As we began driving past a few of them, one of the clowns, either because he was more daring than the others, or just couldn't see very well in his mask, got way too close to the road, and I hit the brakes, not to stop the car but to slow it down. When they saw us slowing down, they made to rush the truck. Alarmed that they were suddenly swarming us, I instinctively hit the gas again. I slammed the front right side of the truck directly into one of them, knocking him down against the pavement. Immediately all the other clowns started yelling and cursing, not really making to help their friend, but instead smashing their fists against the outside of the truck. Odo told me to put it in park, which I did, and he pulled a handgun from under the passenger seat. It was my uncle's gun, but I knew for a fact that it wasn't loaded because the firing pin was broken, and the gun wasn't able to fire. He rolled down the window and pointed the gun directly at one of the clowns. The clowns immediately backed off. Then he yelled, "Give me a reason!" For a moment, there was just silence as the clowns backed away a few steps, but not enough for me to hit the gas and safely floor it out of there. Odo gestured to the clown on the pavement. "Is he alright?" The clown on the ground started crawling with his hands and knees and was shuffling away. Another clown carefully helped him to his feet. "Make a space." Odo gestured with the gun to the clowns in front of the truck, and they immediately parted. I put the car into drive and slowly started edging forward. "We have a dash cam, so don't bother calling the cops." Odo kept the gun pointed at all of them until we were far enough away, then rolled the passenger window back up. Seeing all those clowns clumped in the middle of the road in my rearview mirror was one of the strangest things I had ever seen. Odo placed the gun back under the seat before muttering that he hoped that the headlight wasn't cracked. When we got home, we opened some beers and watched Game of Thrones, and didn't even bring it up to my uncle when he got home. We didn't actually have a dash cam, but figured that there was no way for the clowns to know that for certain. I hope they learned something from this, because next time, I don't plan on hitting the brakes.
Back when I first moved away for college, my mom and dad bought me this beat-up old Toyota Matrix so I could drive home whenever I'd wanted. I grew to hate the old piece of trash after a while, but it got me from point A to B, and it helped me get a job as a delivery driver for a pizza place, so I'll always appreciate the gesture. But then one night, when I was making a delivery, something happened that meant that from that night on, I never got into the driver's seat of it ever again. So, like I said, I'm making deliveries one night, and I'd just gotten back into my car after dropping off a bunch of pizzas at an apartment building when I suddenly realized I hadn't locked the passenger side door. And the only reason I realized I hadn't locked the door was because this guy opens up the door and climbs into my car. Then right as I'm about to tell the guy to get out, I see he has a gun. I'm too scared to even say anything, and he just points it right in my face and says all out of breath, "Drive." As I'm pulling into the street, literally trembling in my seat, I see these two cops sprinting out of an alley in my rear view, and that's when it hits me that they were probably chasing him, and they probably had enough time to call in my license plate. Turns out I was dead right about that, because the next thing I know, I see flashing lights in the rear view. I didn't even have to look over at the guy. I just see him raise the gun up, pointing it at me, and he says, "If you stop this car, I'll blow your head off." So I drove and kept driving until we were out in the suburbs. The whole time the cops are tailing, and they're not shouting like "pull over" or whatever through their bullhorns or whatever you call it, and I figured it's because they know that the guy basically carjacked me and that there's a hostage situation going on. The whole time the guy's like, "Drive faster," and all I can say is, "I can't. This thing's a piece of trash. If I put my foot down, the engine might freaking give out." So he's content to just delay the inevitable for as long as he could. I don't know exactly how long we were driving because the little digital clock was busted, but after a while we started to see fields and stuff. Then my gas light starts blinking, and I tell the guy that if we don't at least try and stop for gas, that we were eventually just going to come to a rolling stop. He tells me to stop at the next gas station we see, so that's exactly what I do. But not before the guy uses his phone to call 911, telling the operator exactly what's going on, and to tell cops that if they come near the car while we're topping up our gas, he's going to kill the hostage, i.e., me. We eventually pull into this gas station in the middle of nowhere, and I'm absolutely terrified, but I ask him if he wants me to get out to top off the tank. He looks around and sees it's one of those pumps that stays locked unless you pay first, so he says no, but he has to think of something out before he lets me get out of the car. The cops are keeping a safe distance while this is going on, as they obviously thought the guy was straight up ready to kill me, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't think that too. The whole time they're shouting over their mics like, "Let the hostage go, we can work something out, and no one has to die over this, Malcolm. Just surrender, and we'll get you help." He's stalling the whole time, pointing the gun to my head every so often to warn the cops off, and I swear that every time he did it, I thought he was going to pull the trigger and just end it. But looking back, if he did that, the cops would have just swarmed the car and shot him, or at least I think they would have anyway. Then there came a point where I could see that he was trying to work out how to get out of the mess he'd gotten himself into. He knew he couldn't get out of the car to get the clerk to unlock the pumps, as they'd ran for cover as soon as they saw that it was a dangerous situation,
and there was no way for him to get their attention. Then he seemed convinced that if I got out of the car, I'd run off to the cops, like, right away, which, to be fair, was my number one escape plan at the time. He asked me how far we'd go if we just took off with the gas I had in the tank, and I told him about a mile or two, not far at all. And he lets out this real deep sigh, like a balloon deflating or something, which I suppose was exactly what was happening. He was all out of ideas. He knew this was the end of it, and right then, I realized that was the point that he was at his most dangerous. I was pretty much convinced that I was going to die by that point, having gotten it into my head that the guy was going to just go out in a blaze of glory by shooting me and then unloading the rest of his ammo onto the cops. Then when I heard him say himself, "Screw it," and he did something to the gun, like cock it or take the safety off, I thought to myself, this is it. This is how my life ends, in a trashy car with some loser maniac. I shut my eyes, felt my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard I could feel it shaking, and then bang. Only a second later, instead of feeling, well, nothing, I found I could open my eyes. But the first thing I saw when I opened them was a few specks of blood on the dash near the passenger side. Then when I turned, I instantly started dry heaving, because the guy had obviously put the gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger, because there was a ton of blood and chunks of brain matter all over the ceiling of my car. I opened up the door and was puking with my hands raised above my head while I heard the cops shouting, "Get down on the ground." I had to lie in my own puke, man. Just lie there while they ran over with their guns on me just in case I was somehow in on it. It sounds crazy, but I really didn't mind. Knowing it was all over, that I was safe, well, relatively anyway, it was all gravy by that point. Like, I don't even think I can really describe that kind of relief in actual words. I literally felt high off of it. You see and hear about people crying in the aftermath of stuff like that, and I guess that's just how they deal with the emotion. But to me, it kind of felt like I'd won something. Like I beat the carjacker by surviving or whatever. Anyway, I better sign off before this starts sounding too abstract, but I can definitely say I wouldn't wish that kind of experience on anyone. Ever.
Growing up in a small town in Colorado, there weren't a ton of options for work as a 19-year-old who didn't go to college. So when I got my license, I ended up grabbing a job for one of the local diners that I used to love eating at. They had a delivery position, and I also bussed tables when there were no orders to be delivered. The radius for delivery wasn't too large, only about 3.5 miles. What happened was that the diner got a delivery order, and right away I recognized the address. It was one of our regulars, and after their food was made, it would only be a 15-minute drive for me. When I got in my car, I didn't even have to use the GPS because I knew the exact house I was going to. It was a small, single-story house that was in the middle of the woods. I loved this house's long gravel driveway. I would always see small critters like squirrels and other animals running through the trees and along the stone wall that lined the path. The driveway would then open up to an area that had room for about 4 cars to park in, which I loved because they only ever had 1 car in the driveway, so I had enough space to simply turn around instead of having to reverse and make a K-turn. As I made my way down the driveway that evening, I was surprised that I didn't see any animals scurrying around, but I figured since it's getting cold again, it was just that time of year. So I drove all the way down the driveway and pulled in front of the house. As I got out of the car, I couldn't help but feel like someone or something was staring at me. I just brushed it off as the owner looking out of their window, though, and continued around my car to the passenger side to get the food. As I'm leaning into the passenger side of the car, I heard the sound of something moving around behind me. I stood up straight and quickly turned to see what it was, but there was nothing there. I shrugged and continued to get the food out of my car. This time, though, as I was closing the passenger door, I heard what was an unmistakable, deep, growling noise coming from the trees. I tried my best to look into the dark forest where the noise was coming from. As I slowly backed toward the house, that was when I saw it. A medium-sized black bear came running out of the woods. I could hear the snarling coming from it. With each step it took, I turned and sprinted toward the house. And when I reached the steps, I didn't waste time knocking. I grabbed the handle and thankfully, the door was unlocked, so I was able to rush inside. I apologized to the homeowners for barging in like that, but once they looked out their window, they understood. To this day, I still don't think that bear was trying to attack me. If it wanted to get me, it was more than fast enough. If I had to guess, it probably had cubs nearby and was trying to scare me off. Still, I'll never forget the look of those teeth as they charged toward me.